Okay, here we go, episode 3. We're still not a clue who this boy is that keeps popping up, but we might find out a bit more. Okay, but it's the start of a new day where we're picking up. Under no circumstance are you to go near the Earl's hothouse. Mrs. Gilbert's voice echoed in Clara's head the next morning as she slinked around the perimeter of the hothouse where she had last seen the boy. She saw the stooped shoulders of Mr. Gilbert and several of the other gardeners as they pulled up parsnips from the planting beds on the other side of the garden. A man was sitting having a smoke near the fruit trees. A white and brown spaniel curled at his feet. Clara pressed a hand to one of the glass panels. It was damp. She drew a small circle with dotted eyes and a nose and a smiling mouth. She bumped her fingers along the windows until she turned a corner and came to the entrance of the hothouse. Near it was a stump of a felled tree. A felled tree is where it's been cut down. The bark furry with moss. Clara skirted around it and down the 5 stone steps which led to the door. Her breath came a little faster. She brought a hand to her cheek Mrs. Gilbert had slapped. It still hurt when she pressed on it. She tentatively gave the door a push and it swung open with a creak. A wall of soupy warm air hit her in the face. She drew a breath in again. She drew in another, and the tightness in her neck began to dissolve. The boy wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. He only appeared at night, like a fox or a badger. She blinked at the 2 raised planting beds in front of her. Thick metal pipes rose from the ground and travelled under the length of the bed. One of the pipes near her feet gurgled. She bent down and touched it. Ouch! She pulled her thumb away from the heat as it sucked at it. On top of the planting beds sat pots containing spiky oval fruits with crowns of long, sharp-looking leaves. Pineapples! Remember, complete different time to how we live now. Clara smiled and walked down one of the planting rows, past a bench of garden equipment. Metal watering cans, a wicker basket, a small trowel and fork. As she neared the end of the hothouse, the pineapples grew larger and larger. They were like the Matryoshka dolls that she had received in her Christmas stocking one year. You know, the dolls that kind of stack inside each other. You know they are supposed to sit inside one another, don't you? Mother had said with an amused smile. But I feel sorry for the smaller ones. I don't want them to be in the dark, Clara had replied, lining them up in a row on her window ledge. Clara bent down and pressed her thumb onto the hard, spiky husk of a pineapple. Hello, fruit, she said softly. For Clara, pineapple was a treat. She had often seen whole ones at sales at the fruiteers, but only pineapples she had ever tasted had been canned, so sweetened and swimming in syrup that the yellow flesh had made her teeth ache. Last year, one of her mother's friends had rented a homegrown pineapple as a centrepiece for her son's wedding party. Clara had circled around it, oohing and ahhing at it with everyone else. It was as if they were viewing a precious monument in a museum. It cost me a week's pay to rent this, her mother's friend had said proudly. To rent a beautiful fruit and not be able to taste it seemed like the stupidest thing in the world to Clara. When the wedding party had moved into the garden for some raucous and out-of-tune singing and dancing, Clara crept back into the dining room and stood in front of that pineapple. She had reached across and touched one of the spikes. The sudden urge to pick the pineapple up, take a knife to it, chop its flesh into tiny pieces and nibble on it had been so overwhelming. The very same urge was filling her now. She pushed her fingers deep into her apron pockets. Mother had packed 3 aprons, instructing that one be worn each day to protect her dresses from the outdoors, and felt the tips of the envelopes. She sighed, pulled it out and sank to the floor, her dress, skirt and apron poofing around her like a mushroom. She nibbled on a fingernail. Should she open it? It wasn't one of the feared pink telegrams that Mrs. Buxton over the road had received to inform her of the death of her son. The poor woman had taken to her bed, and 4 months later she was still in it, her bedroom curtains tightly drawn. But surely letters from the War Office could only mean one of 2 things: injury or death. Finding out the truth would change everything. Was she ready for the truth? Were any of them? Heavy feet thumped down the steps to the hothouse. There was a muffled cough at the doorway. Clara scrabbled to her feet and pushed the envelope back into her pocket. Curling her nails into her palms, she held her breath as the door to the hothouse swung open and a flood of fresh air rushed down the steps. So we're not quite sure what the envelope is, but it's coming from the War Office about someone either being lost in war, dead or injured, but we don't know who it's about. Chapter 5. Milky-Eyed Man. A young man wearing a gardening jacket with a mustard yellow lining stared at Clara from the top of the hothouse steps, his forehead as furrowed as a newly seeded planting bed outside. He pushed his round spectacles up to his nose as Clara continued to hold her breath, waiting for the telling off which was surely about to come. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Clara racked her brain for something sensible to say. Should she say she was cold and she had to come in for warmth? Yet it was warm outside, the October sun admitting a welcoming glow that in a few weeks would be gone. Maybe she should say she'd been passing and heard a noise and came in to investigate. Or she could just tell the truth, that she'd been curious as to why Mrs. Gilbert was so adamant she was not to come anywhere near the hothouse. "I was curious," Clara said eventually. His eyes narrowed. Clara saw the lens to his left eye was covered in a milky film. The young man walked towards her. "You're Alfred's niece, aren't you?" "Alfred?" Clara said in confusion, trying not to stare at the man's cloudy eye. "Mr. Gilbert?" "Oh, yes," Clara said, a flush rising up to her neck like a vine. Now that the man was closer, Clara saw he was barely a man at all, maybe 16 or 17. He leaned on the workbench. "I guess being curious is a good reason as any. I'm Robert, one of the undergardeners, and you are—" "Clara," she replied with a shy smile. I hope you don't mind me asking, but what's an undergardener?" Robert smiled and picked up a metal trowel from the bench. "I suppose I'm an assistant to Mr. Gilbert. I know this and that about plants and equipment, though there are plenty of other better gardeners than me. If I'm honest, all the ins and outs of it can get a bit confusing sometimes." "Yeah, I imagine it must," said Clara. "So, what do you make of the hothouse? The Earl's pride and joy they are," Robert said, jabbing at the soil around one of the plants with a trowel. "They are lovely. The plants are so different to what's grown outside," Clara said. Robert looked up. "The Earl is a collector of tropical plants. I think he imagines himself to be an explorer, although he doesn't find these plants himself. He sends other people overseas to do that." "Does he visit these hothouses often then?" Clara asked, glancing at the door. It would not do at all for the Earl to catch her in there. Imagining Mrs. Gilbert's reaction made her clutch to the edge of the planting bed. "Not anymore." Robert placed the trowel down, reaching across and stroked one of the pineapple leaves. "You'll more often find him sitting in the summer house now." "The summer house?" said Clara. Robert jerked a thumb over his shoulder towards the door. "It overlooks the lake, a small brick building with big windows and doors. It's heated just like these hothouses, but it's not for growing plants. The Earl and his family use it for entertaining their guests, or as a place to sit on a fair day." "But how sad that the Earl doesn't come and see his own plants, to have someone collect and grow them for you, but not to visit them," said Clara. Robert smiled, then his expression became dreamy and far away. "I would like to visit where these pineapples are grown. Sometimes I come in here and imagine beaches with silky sand, azure blue seas that are so warm as the bath filled with rainbow-coloured fishes and coral." He sighed heavily, like a weight was attached to his shoulders. "Not much chance of that with a war on, though." Robert sounded like her father. She wished he would just carry on talking, but he was silent now, his head bowed as he sieved the soil through his fingers. "Is your father at war?" Robert asked suddenly. Clara's shoulders stiffened. "He was," she replied. "A soldier in uniform, marching." She stamped on the thought before they took control of her lungs and made it difficult to breathe. The warm was air and thick was silence. Robert's fingers stilled. He looked up. "He came back then?" Clara nodded. "I'm mostly blind in my left eye. I was born like it. I wouldn't pass the medical exam if I tried to enlist in the army," he said. His head was bowed again, but Clara thought his cheeks were a little redder than before. 5 of Mr. Gilbert's gardeners have been conscripted. That means signed up for war. means lots more work for the rest of us. There's even talk of women from the village coming to help, as there are so few men. Robert patted the soil around the base of one of the pineapple plants. But I'm doing my bit. Today I took a cart of vegetables and fruit from the garden to a military hospital. We'll be sending 4 carts a week from now on. The Earl says we must help the war effort. An idea was bubbling at the edge of Clara's brain. Make yourself useful, Mrs. Gilbert had said when she arrived. Could I help? Clara asked quietly. Help, said Robert. In the gardens. I could pick apples or pull vegetables or something for the hospital. Robert smiled. Know much about gardening, do you? Clara felt a flush in her already hot cheeks deepen. I could learn. Robert's good eye was thoughtful. We are short of gardeners, he tapped a finger on his chin. Let me talk to your uncle. Clara smiled her thanks and turned to leave. Oh, the boy who works in the garden. Who's he? Robert stood up, brushed the dirt from his palm. A boy? A frown puckered from his forehead. He took a step towards her. The only boy who works here is Red, the hall boy. Hall boy? You really don't know how this place works, do you? Said Robert in an amused voice. Red stokes the boilers, polishes shoes, does the jobs no one else wants to do, and earns pittance for it too. And he's called Red, Clara said, scrunching her nose. On account of his hair, Robert said with a grin. The boy Clara had seen in the garden at night had not got red hair. She was sure of it. What did this boy look like? Asked Robert, his head tilted. It must have been my eyes playing tricks. Sometimes I get nightmares, she said lightly, hoping that Robert didn't pick up the waver in her voice. Said Robert, pushing his hands into his pocket. At the door, Clara turned. Please don't tell Mrs. Gilbert I was in here. She asked me to keep away from the hothouse. A flash of something crossed Robert's face. It was too lightning quick for Clara to decipher what it meant. Your secret's safe with me, he said. Throwing him a quick smile, Clara pushed through the door, ran up the stone steps and out into the breezy sunshine. Oh, and Clara? Clara turned. Robert was standing in the doorway. He pushed his spectacles further up his nose again. If you do happen across this boy another time, and he turns out to be not one of your nightmares, be sure to let me know. Clara stared at him for a second, then gave him a brief nod. Robert did not believe the boy was a figment of her imagination. That much was clear. But something told Clara that she needed to keep the boy a secret from Robert and everyone else until she found out exactly who he was and what he was doing in the Earl's garden. So the mystery of who the boy is still remains. But we've met Robert, and Clara might be helping out in the gardens. So the thing with the pineapples, they were quite rare and spectacular in those days. Like you wouldn't just go to the shop and find pineapples on the show. So it's quite impressive that he's got hothouses full of them there. Okay, that's important for the book. See you tomorrow.